thank you for coming to this session. As you can see, I'm sitting here next to a laptop, and that is because we're having what they call a blended session now of people who are here in the room for real. In this case, we've got Sally Penni over here. She's the founder of Women in Law UK organisation. She was named Diversity and Inclusion Leader of the Year at the inaugural Northern Leadership. Next to her is Amelia, who's a reporter from The Guardian. She was named Journalist of the Year in 2018 for her investigations into Windrush, and also won the Paul Foot Award, the Cudlip Award, and the Amnesty Prize for reporting. But the blended bit is that we've got Togara Muzanenhamo, who is streaming in from Zimbabwe. Is that correct? I can't.
Yes.
From the US?
From Harare, Zimbabwe.
Okay.
No. From Harare, Zimbabwe.
Oh, from Harare in Zimbabwe. Yes, okay. So there he is. You see, he's the mystery guest. Can you see them all waving? You see the audience waving at you? Well, they are.
Can't,
okay, you can't see them, but they're waving at you,
well,
and they're incredibly
I'm
excited.
back.
You're more exciting than we are. Well, A, because you're much, much bigger, because you're like 5 times bigger because you're on a big screen. And also, don't you think, even though we've Zoomed for 18 months, the magic of technology is still there, isn't it? So really, really pleased. What time is it in Harare?
It's 12 now.
Okay, so only an hour's difference.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so Togara is one of the 30 poets who's going to read his poem Untitled at the end of this session, but he's also going to take part in the discussion. And thanks very much for joining us and for making the time.
No,
so
thank you.
This session is about the power of policy. You know, we heard earlier that obviously, you know, law is not the only thing that moves societies. In fact, it is often the thing that doesn't move societies. What moves societies is movements and voices and individual stories that gather momentum. However, the power of policy is undoubtedly enormous, and if the policies are wrong-footed or deliberately intended to be hostile or harming, then you can end up as an individual in society incredibly harmed and powerless. So we're going to talk about that. And you know, so many things have happened during COVID, including emergency policies that have come into place that we perhaps don't know the full consequences of. Money regimes have used with COVID as an opportunity, I think, to bring kind of almost under the wire things that we wouldn't have wanted to happen. And then there are sort of policies when people decide to make things better, in inverted commas, which, you know, for example, the whole kind of debacle over universal credit, where new policies are brought in to deal with welfare, but the actual ramifications maybe haven't been thought through, or have been, but people have decided to ignore the harmful consequences. So all of these things are we're going to talk about together, and then hand over to you for questions. So let's get straight to it. Amelia, I mean, you've been an investigative journalist and so you'll have many, many examples. But the thing that you sort of have become famous for in the immediate context is Windrush, and Manchester and many places are experiencing the pain of the Windrush consequences. So I wonder if you could talk about how you unveiled this and what the policies were intended to do and what they've actually done.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for asking me here. I mean, I think Windrush is a really good kind of inverse example of good policy making, in that it was a very, very clear result of a new policy that was brought in with the express desire to cut net migration to the UK. And although it went through, although the policies that caused it went through all of the usual channels of impact assessments and consultation, the processes that are in place in Whitehall in order to check whether policies are going to have harmful impacts somehow didn't work. And I think it is a really, really good example of policy making going wrong. So the origins of it really go back to about 2012 when David Cameron was in government with in coalition with the Lib Dems, and Theresa May at that point was Home Secretary. She decided that it was very important for the government to look very tough on immigration, and unveiled a whole series of policies that became known as the hostile environment legislation, which were designed to make life very, very difficult for people in the UK who didn't have documentation proving that they were here legally. So immigration checks were brought out from airports and ports and into kind of everyday life, so that you got a kind of equivalent of an immigration check when you went to the doctor, when you tried to get a new job or new housing, or to get a driving license or a mobile phone. When those policies were going through Whitehall, and when they were going forward to the Commons for legislation, there was a lot of consultation on them, and a number of warnings were raised by charities that deal with immigration, by organisations like the Runnymede Trust that deal with racial discrimination. And they highlighted that the possible impact of these policies could be that people who had lived in this country for a long time but had been born elsewhere could find themselves inadvertently designated as illegal immigrants. And somehow those warnings were ignored in the policy-making process, and the legislation went ahead with the consequences that we now know about, that thousands of people who were in the UK entirely legally were mistakenly designated as illegal immigrants with really catastrophic consequences. Some of them were deported, some of them were made homeless, some of them were sacked from their jobs, and many found life extremely difficult. So I think when we're thinking about kind of policy making and how to make policy well, it is a really useful example to think about, because kind of all the way along you can point to mistakes that were made.
And could you just explain to us a bit about how a policy comes into being? So a minister, in this case Theresa May, can think up something called the hostile environment, which actually, if I remember, was bubbling up from David Blunkett onwards. My memory of this hostile environment idea is that both Labour and Conservatives have been wanting to demonstrate that they're tough on immigration and found various sort of ways of doing it. But a minister decides they're going to create a policy, and then there's a white paper, a green paper. How does a policy go through scrutiny, even if eventually it fails?
Yeah, so you're right that this concept of making Britain a hostile place for people who were unable to prove that they had the right to be here legally is a policy that goes back, decades, I suppose, but it really ramped up under Labour, and we began to see much bigger fines, for example, on employers who were found to be employing people who didn't have the correct paperwork. But there's no arguing with the fact that the policy kind of increased in severity exponentially from about 2012 onwards, which is when Theresa May at the top of the Home Office began to think about ways of showing that the government, or the Conservative-led government, was very, very tough on immigration. And there was a clear political incentive for doing that. So this was at a time when UKIP was going up in the polls, and where there was a real concern that the Conservatives were kind of losing votes in areas where there was a kind of almost fabricated concern about immigration. I think one of the interesting things in the fallout from all of this is that there was quite a kind of moment of sensitive discussion, both on the left and the right, about how it was that immigration had become to be accepted by both kind of major parties as something that needed to be seen as a problem, and therefore something that both parties needed to devise policies to address, rather than there being a kind of separate discussion about, the benefits of immigration. Anyway, Theresa May made it her key priority in the Home Office to tighten immigration policies. And a lot of this was about kind of presentation rather than a sense that the policies that she was introducing were going to kind of be transformative, because I think there was an understanding at the time that, with freedom of movement, there was actually not that much that could be done about the kind of rising net migration numbers. So if the government was unable to actually do something about it, they decided they'd like to be able to kind of show that they were acting tough. And so, as well as the hostile environment measures, this was also a time when there was kind of PR moves around acting tough on immigration. So we remember the buses that were commissioned to go around areas of high immigration, particularly in London, that said, go home or face arrest if you're here illegally. So the background is a political sense that something needs to be inside the government's kind of offer to voters that shows them to be acting tough on a policy area that is deemed significant for kind of core electorate, and in this case an area where the government felt that it was showing weaknesses in polling.
So if the result, what you're saying is that it was a grandstanding moment where even the phrase hostile environment is kind of almost like a PR thing. There's not that much they can do in many respects, because, as I say, freedom of movement means that there are lots and lots of very necessary people coming into work and be part of the UK, which we're now suffering the lack of. But once this policy was demonstrated to the civil service that it was going to have unexpected, terrible consequences for our own British citizens, i.e. Windrush generation, it seemed unstoppable. It seemed like, you'd think, wouldn't you, that it was going to go, look, this is going to be bad. Okay, sorry, we'll stop this second now and do something about it. But, I mean, it's still going on, isn't it? There's still the problems.
Well, I mean, I think there are two things. I mean, I think before the policy was legislated on, there were these warnings and there were these consultation papers put on ministers' desks that said, if you do this, it's liable to have a discriminatory impact. And there were organisations that were highlighting that it was very difficult in the abstract to think of a bit of legislation that made life tough for people who were here illegally, without also making life tough for people who looked like they were here illegally, because most people who were being asked to make those kind of decisions between who to behave in a hostile way towards were not immigration officers, were not people trained in understanding who had the correct documentation and who didn't. So they were liable to reach for kind of shortcuts, and the warnings were that those shortcuts would be around looking at the colour of a person's skin, looking at their accent, or looking at their name. So those warnings were there. What we don't know is what the conversations were internally within the Home Office that allowed ministers and advisors to kind of brush those warnings to one side. And certainly in the aftermath of the Windrush scandal, there was a lot of kind of questioning about whether or not there was inherent racism in the decision not to take those warnings seriously, given that the warnings were suggesting that there would be an unknown number of people who'd come from Commonwealth countries, largely from the Caribbean, who were likely to be affected. And for whatever reason, those warnings were not thought to be significant.
Significant. Okay. I just going to check. Togara, can you hear us, by the way?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I know you can't see us, but so Sally, I'm going to move to you, right? So you have, and this is just one example of a policy that has unexpected consequences, or consequences where where perhaps there were some things that were told to be expected but ignored anyway. Once people find themselves in the midst of policies which are unjust, unfair, inappropriate to their circumstances, but nevertheless they're sort of swept inside them, what then happens to them? What recourse have they got? How do they use the law? How do they access justice?
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me on this brilliant panel, and I was gripped by what Amelia had to say. Secondly, I practice law. I don't practice immigration law, so anything I say is not quite in the context of immigration specialist, as an immigration specialist. But once people are stuck in that, then the recourse is judicial review. Now, if you read The Guardian like I do, or any papers, you'll see the judicial review takes a long time. And albeit I don't practice in immigration law, as lawyers, there isn't a week that goes by without somebody sending me a petition to stop an aeroplane or a plane taken off where people are being deported unjustly because their cases haven't reached the decision-making tribunal, if you like, to stop deportations and other means. So people are kind of stuck. And the difficulty is that if they have families, because of course a lot of this happens much later for a lot of people, some are in detention centres. There have been numerous reports by the prison inspectorate saying that a lot of these detention centres are not fit for purpose. Even worse during COVID, if you can imagine, they're overcramped. In the same way as prisons are, but in a worse, because these are people without status often, if they're immediate arrivals. But in terms of nationals who have been, they are a bit stuck. So it is difficult to then stop the course of action. There is no real remit to, I don't want to be dramatic when we go across the pond to, I don't want to call them brothers either, but our American side, where they've got the death penalty, worryingly, there still. And I know there are keen people wanting it to return to England, but I oppose it. It's a bit like that, in that sense, that unless there is an intervening act to stop it, people are a little stuck. But let me just give another example, if I may. The Windrush scandal, I know Amelia's book's called Betrayal, actually. I think both are equally good descriptions for what happened, is still going on now. And it was the first time, I think, for members of the public who are not practitioners, they're not barristers like me wearing funny wigs in court and advocating for people, just ordinary people suddenly thought, crikey, this has gone on, nobody heeded the warnings, and it was ignored. But it does happen in other legislation, perhaps not at that sort of grand scale either, where the policy has been intended to be good. And if I may, indulge me for a moment, let me just give you a very simple example. Do you all remember antisocial behaviour orders? Right. The reasoning, so as lawyers, I'm not interested in politics apart from voting, but as lawyers, we don't really look at what the politicians are doing as such, but it's important to understand the climate in which these things come, in which Amelia was leading to. But we go back to Hansard, which is the documents or the debates in Parliament, to understand what was the intention there on specific legislation. So criminal antisocial behaviour orders started off to try and get youths off the streets, congregating, then committing offences. That was a general gist. Seems like a good idea if they're causing a nuisance in an area. Then they got out of hand, where literally young people were getting, they're now called criminal antisocial behaviour orders, were getting them for anything. So they couldn't breathe. They couldn't actually leave their homes, quite frankly. And so there were, obviously that's not on a mass scale, because we're talking about smaller areas and smaller parts of the country. And so that was actually a breach of the rights and freedoms and so on. So that was then modified. But come forward to 2021, 2020, you can use that criminal antisocial behaviour orders, this is a policy decision, in the context of drill music. Now, does everyone know what drill music is? Well, you can Google it afterwards. I won't do any impression. Drill music is people rapping, essentially, and talking about their experiences. Some of them may involve violence, some of them may involve other things, but it's just rap and it's culture. And so drill music is now, the lyrics from drill music is now used in the courts as bad character evidence as part of a criminal offence. It's just music. Now, forgive me, but do you remember when Tom Jones sang Delilah? I was going to, I want to repeat, I don't want to sing it.
You're going to do a rendition?
Yeah, no, I can't. I'm good at the law, but I can't sing. But the words are really about domestic violence. Now, everyone is nodding, but has anyone been convicted on the basis that they listened to Delilah and thereafter their actions were as a result from that? No. So there are some funny things going on with the statutes and the laws and how they've been used, because actually now you can use the criminal ASBO to stop people making any more music.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't help feeling, that a lot of the intended consequences or opportunistic nature of how the laws are then used are really aimed at people who have the least power.
Yes.
So, you don't seem to end up with unintended consequences for, people at Goldman Sachs all kind of going, I've fallen foul of this policy.
Yeah.
How did that happen? That doesn't seem to be the case.
No, it doesn't. And we see that in other areas, such as short, snap sentences, 12-week sentences, which are intended to be punitive, but as by way of an example, and stop people committing offences. The reality is that the manner in which the prison system, the criminal justice system is here, that those who receive the short, snap 12-week sentences are the most vulnerable. For instance, women who are sentenced for repeated offences of shoplifting and so on and so forth. And there are lots of guidance and guidelines about sentencing in this country and in our country, but that still happens. So let me just pose an example. The woman who is stealing repeatedly nappies, ham, food, right? What does that tell you if you, and I'd encourage everybody to be magistrates, because anybody can be a magistrate, so that we've got ordinary people hearing these things and making decisions. That tells you that she doesn't have any money, she's a victim of the austerity measures, but she has numerous children and is probably working, but hasn't got sufficient amount to cover food. So she steals, and she steals repeatedly. Now, a message needs to go out to say, we mustn't steal. And I know I'm making this very basic, but just indulge me for a moment. So you give the 12-week snap sentence, right? Either she's offended before, or it's a lesser offence. And she's sentenced for 12 weeks. One, she'll serve half, so she's out in 6 weeks. Children, housing, what happens? They go into care. The housing is gone. And she will reside in, most likely, in looking at the statistics, a low-cost housing area. So it's a cycle. So when she's released from prison, there is no support and the stability is gone. So the 12-week sentence, which was intended to be a deterrent, has an unintended consequence. And it's a whole other debate. Why is it that actually women disproportionately are given custodial sentences in the first instance? So there are a raft of examples. I don't want to sort of bore everyone, but that sort of policy making, in theory, sounds rather good. It's not congesting the prison system to fatigue.
Short, quick deterrent, yes.
Yes.
But
But
the collapse of the infrastructure that this fragile family person has had,
yes,
it then has huge, devastating consequences and costs.
yes.
So, Togara, can I come to you? I mean, examples of unexpected policy consequences that you're aware of. There's a phrase here: the 20th century is the most thoughtless and the most thoughtful of times. So we probably have the best educated politicians and legislators for a long time. It doesn't stop them making policies that are absolutely unfit for purpose.
Well, I can speak from a personal point of view where I've been affected by some policies which were put in place. And for instance, as a writer, sometimes I need to move around to certain places. And at the beginning of my career, I was not making sufficient amount of money, like most writers from any country. So I was I was trying to travel to a festival, which I was invited to. And I couldn't prove that I had sufficient amount of money in my bank account locally, but the festival had guaranteed that I would be taken care of. But then once I submitted my passport and got it back several days later, the visa was refused on the grounds that I would not return back to my country because my country was listed as one of the countries where there was high poverty and there was a lot of people who were absconding to other countries. So we were put on a level where people were on high alert that if you were Zimbabwean, you were not going to return. So in an effect, that also just put, it sort of stalled my career in a way. But then as a small person, I can't really go up to somebody and say, look, how do you discern who is legitimate and who is not legitimate? I think he just, the officer who was making the decision, I think he had a certain criteria which he had to make a list on, but and I fell into one of those criteria, but it did harm my writing because I felt I would have had benefited by meeting other artists and having discussions with them, and had no intention of staying within that country and returning back home. So there are some certain things which are in place, and things like that are still in place today, where people are stopped from moving from one place to another, just based on an assumption.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly know that the visa system in our country is really unjust in terms of freedom of movement from countries, as you've said. And one of the things that the arts organisations are always trying to do is lobby for poets and musicians and visual artists to be able to come, travel, share experiences, bring their experiences. But we're always being told that these particular artists, they're always from some set countries, can't come. And when that happens to you, and as you say, it has a direct impact on your livelihood, on your international reputation, on your publishing possibilities, how do you get other people to work for you in order to try to trigger your human rights? How do you get people to try to do something on your behalf?
It's very difficult because you then walk up and it's a huge wall that's in front of you. And it's a wall that you cannot climb. And there's most probably a door somewhere, but you don't know where that door is and who is the holder of the key to that door. So by the time you find all of that out, your opportunity has already been lost.
Yeah, it makes you think of Alice in Wonderland, doesn't it? That, do you eat a mushroom and grow taller to get through one door, or swallow a lotion to get little, and then the key's too big? Let me turn to the audience, and here's your chance to ask questions, or anybody have your own story of a policy that you either knew was intended to make life more difficult for you or your community, or unexpectedly did. Anybody got any questions that they would like to put or thoughts on this? Yes, please do.
I like the thought about Alice in Wonderland. I thought it was good.
There's a microphone there, just grab it.
Yeah, I like the thought of, I like what you said about making that analogy of Alice in Wonderland and also getting big and small. So sometimes, yeah, I mean, what I've found is to try and make myself appear bigger than I am when speaking to policy decision makers and things like that. And then sometimes you do have to keep a low profile and be small, so there is a balance and find it and using what you can.
What's your background? What do you work within, or what have your circumstances been where that kind of big or small thing has come about? No.
There's a lot.
There's a lot. Okay. All right. You've got a rich history. Anybody else want to make a comment or a thought? Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to kind of say about how we're talking about unintended policy. Maybe I'm naive, but I think naivety brings truth sometimes. But when I hear about the way some policy has created unintended consequences, a lot of the time I'm like, well, of course that was going to happen. Wouldn't you have thought that was going to happen? And you were saying about we have some of the most educated people in positions now. I find it very hard to believe that people do not understand that these were unintended. I really do believe that people are very much aware of what will happen, and that people will allow that for their own personal gain, or like you were using that very basic example of the woman that steals for her family, and then she goes into the justice system, and then she comes out of the justice system, and well, what she's got nothing because she's lost it. And I think that people would rather allow people like that to drop out of the system altogether. That people don't want people who might think and break the law for moral gain themselves to be allowed back into a system where they could do things morally but break the law.
Right.
Again, and just kind of asking about, do you think that unintended?
Okay, so the question is really, can we really believe that people are so sort of naive, innocent or thoughtless that they don't understand? But and your kind of thing is, well, they'd rather actually punish people in some ways.
Because I feel like we all have our own brains and minds, and we do think, oh, well, of course, you have your own thoughts, so how people who are educated in positions of power, well, how can they not have those thoughts? If we, the common people, have those thoughts ourselves.
It does feel astonishing, doesn't it? I'll come back to the speakers in a minute. Like, yes, is somebody down here? Could we just take a few?
Should I wait?
Yeah, it's nearly here.
Thank you, the four of you. I think for a lot of people, even the word policy is dry, isn't it? And they think whatever, but it's so important. And I just wonder, given the context of the event, whether any of you can give us examples of a policy that has effected great change and enabled human rights and been positive either here or anywhere, just to be able to picture it.
Okay, so what's been a great policy change? Any more thoughts? We'll take there and then...
Thank you. I think one of the aspects of this is the actual human misery that is involved in these consequences, and that description that was made of the mother, the actual misery. I've got a friend who is currently she's become agoraphobic, she's terrified that her children are going to be taken away, she's lived in this country for 25 years, and she's having to get a lawyer to try to prove that she has the right to be a British citizen. It's shocking. And that's one of thousands and thousands of hidden cases. Normally, most people don't come across this, and I'm lucky that I did come across this woman and can give her some moral and emotional support, which I think sometimes is all that we can do. But I think one of the things is talking about the environment, the hostile environment. That wasn't a policy. That was an atmosphere that was created. The policy was to create a lot of people who would be regarded as the other. And so I'm amazed that they used that term, hostile environment, because it's so blatantly obvious. And that atmosphere, as Amelia said, was created in the time of UKIP. It was all about politics. It was all about the fear of the Conservative Party losing its voters to UKIP. And the damage that UKIP has done using the Conservative Party as its vehicle to create these divisions and to make us look at each other with suspicion. And I live in an area in West Yorkshire that's got a lot of a very mixed citizenry. And it's easy for some of my elderly neighbours to think that when we talked about immigrants, we were talking about the Asian family that ran the corner shop or the laundrette, because they felt overwhelmed by this presence of the changes to the society that they'd seen as white.
Yes.
And so that played on that fear. I'm sorry I've gone on a bit, but those are just the sorts of comments that I feel when we're looking at what kind of agency do we have as an individual, get to know people individually and give them that support, even if it's not, and then you're not a member of a larger organisation.
Yeah.
So that would be my message to people, is to
get to know people properly. Could you pass the microphone on to this guy here? Thank you.
Thank you. Just when you spoke about unintended consequences and policy that I'm aware of, particularly from the work that I've done, is as part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy, there's a piece of policy which some of you might well be aware of called PREVENT.
PREVENT, yeah.
Yes, and it's been in many guises, but kind of when it came around after the 7th of July bombings, in its initial phase and initial documentation, it was talking about promoting democratic values. And today, I have parents who tell me that they tell their children not to talk about certain subjects in school because they fear that they might be reported under PREVENT. And then there's a whole host of things that around certain bits of policy and bills that went through. So I remember there was the 2006 Glorification of Terrorism Bill, and I remember that then Prime Minister Tony Blair being questioned about in which circumstances would it be okay to talk about certain subjects. And he said, well, in places like university, you can in academia, you can challenge and talk about certain subjects in a very free and open way. But I have people who talk to me and say they don't share certain views and opinions in university. And I'm just making it very personal to myself. And part of growing up in this society and kind of going through that journey, particularly around that time when I was at university, is being able to explore sometimes, stupid ideas in that space. And I think there's a generation, certainly the generation that's grown up post 9/11 or 20 years on, of young Muslims that don't feel they can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that kind of idea of silencing and, and constraining around, very clear racism, I would say, and very clear kind of anti-poverty, anti-communities of poverty. But going back to the points, Amelia, the point that you're making at the back, sorry, I don't know your name, that can we really believe these are unexpected and unintended when these people are so educated and have power, have been given power?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't remember if I said that the kind of ill effects of the hostile environment legislation were unintended. If I said that that's certainly the government's excuse and defence, and in all of their apologies, they made it very clear that this was not what they had intended. And I'm sure that there's a kernel of truth in that. They certainly didn't intend to create the scandal that happened, and they, I don't believe that they intended to target the particular group of people who suffered so appallingly. However, they did intend to create a very hostile environment for people who weren't able to prove that they were here legally, and they were aware that there would be a grey area of an unknown quantity of people who would have real difficulties. So, that whole question of what was deliberate policy and what was unintended, unexpected kind of collateral damage is absolutely central to the question. But I don't think that the government can be in any way forgiven for kind of trying to brush the issue away by saying this was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was the playing out of a policy that was deliberately designed to make life very, very difficult for this group of people.
Togara, the thing about giving policies, whether it be drill music or conversations about what Islam could mean and couldn't mean, or what your own communities are allowed to discuss. Do you feel this, somebody who's so committed to language and words, do you feel as if there is fear being created in societies that present themselves as democratic? But do you think there is fear being presented as like there are things you can't talk about or write about or shouldn't be doing? I'm not talking about the culture wars here. I'm talking about sort of something that's to do with, I suppose, constraining particular communities and making them feel they haven't got verbal rights.
Well, just the fact that you're using the word to constrain those communities, I think, yes. By suppressing those communities, I also feel that it gives them a feeling of having less power and less power to act in order to change these sort of policies.
So it's
But I'm sure there must be some intention behind when these policies are being made, and discussions behind the actual intention, where the arrow should be shot and where it should land.
So, Sally, that's a really important idea, that there is a kind of feeling, I think that's a great analogy, that there's an intention about where the arrow should land and where it shouldn't land. And so when it lands in the mark, i.e. usually people who have the least power and the most fear, what can they do and what do we do? I mean, I take your point that we try to educate ourselves and talk to each other and give neighbourly support and emotional support, but what can we do when policies come into being or are coming towards us?
Yes, so one of the things, and this is a Ripples of Hope, so it's quite a depressing session, I'm afraid, so I'll do my best to give a bit of hope.
Yes, off you go.
That there are consultations. So when the policies are coming to be implemented, certainly in terms of laws, there will be, the Law Commission, for example, will have consultations. And so it's important for people to reply to the consultation. That is one of the, and it doesn't have to be necessarily the communities where they're expecting the arrows to land, the more vulnerable, those communities that don't want to exist. We could all be allies in many different ways. So write a reply to the consultation, ask a lawyer to look at it. You've all heard the term activist lawyer, which the Home Secretary used to describe certain lawyers. Would probably be used to describe me, I don't know. If it is, I wear it with pride. But we're not quite in the constraints of what's happening in Eastern Europe and Hong Kong and Myanmar. When people speak out, they're thrown into prison. Then when the lawyers go to defend them, they're thrown into prison. We're not quite there yet. But we can respond to things like consultations. We can write to ministers. Yes, we can educate ourselves. Life is busy. Yes, we've had 18 months off and we still don't have enough time. But we have to be allies in different ways on these subjects. And that includes having good investigative reporters, a press that is free to investigate properly and respond and reveal legislation and policies which are coming into being, and for us all to continue to be actively anti policies which supposedly have unintended consequences. So I think we need to continue reading. I think we need to think about what consultations are coming up, and I think we need to be looking at anything that comes out. What might be the consequences? Because the lady is right, I can't quite see you. You didn't say your name. That, people are astounded that those are the consequences. And then when they say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't think that would happen. Of course it was going to happen. And it's how we deal with those. So let me just mention very quickly online abuse. Is everyone aware of online abuse? You don't have to share if you've received it. That would be horrible. But I hope you haven't. So we need to do something about online abuse, particularly of from people of certain groups, black female politicians for one, who are disproportionately abused. But all of it is abhorrent and dreadful, okay? So there's an act. I'm a bit of a geek, so I know lots of laws. So there's an act called the Computer Misuse Act, and it's got lots of remedies, but they're out of date. The act isn't even that old. It's like 96, 97 or something. But it's out of date because there are no real punitive measures with teeth. So the Home Secretary announced in a conference earlier this year, I think it was in May, that there would be a consultation on how to deal with online abuse. And so that consultation will be open to members of the public, anybody, to write with your ideas and respond to the ideas that come. That is one of the ways that we could try. There was a lady there asking for positivity, that we could at least say, because all consultations have to be documented with who's responded and so on and so forth, or you can write a consultation, be part of a bigger group or a bigger movement. So there's a move on violence against women, so you could be part of Women's Aid and see what they're doing by way of a formal consultation and add your voice to those so that we are bigger in numbers. So they would be some of the ways. And I suppose the last point would be, nobody wants any more lawyers in the world, I'm sure, but think about other ways that, lawyers can do pro bono work, or causes, like that lady who was talking there about the friend who has got to prove her nationality. That's dreadful, and there probably isn't, I don't know, because I don't practice in immigration law. If it went to the higher courts, something I would get involved. But find ways to engage with some of those who can make the pushes and push things forward, because there are many things. I don't want to continue listing some of the laws with the unintended consequences. But I will give you a positive, if I can.
Yeah.
That was a question from the audience. So there was a statute brought in to deal with migrant workers who use forged documents to obtain employment, right? So it's quite straightforward. And the idea is to discourage people using false passports or reproducing birth certificates and so on and so forth. I rolled my eyebrows because what actually happened in that statute was that care homes, where most people who have died in the COVID pandemic have come from, have a lot of migrant workers. And so they employed a great deal of these. But what would happen is, somewhere along the line, national insurance contribution, or there'll be some tax issue, there'd be a check, which then, of course, would reveal the means of which that employee obtained the employment. And so then it becomes a criminal offence, forged document. And in that case, you have to go to prison. There was no statute. So can you imagine? Somebody's been working in a care home, looking after my nan, your nan, beautifully, wonderfully. They've not committed any offences. They've just been working because they wanted employment, but they've used a document to obtain it. That is illegal. They've got to suddenly go to prison, and that was abhorrent. So what's happened, the positivity test, is that now that's not the case. You don't go to prison. So there has to be certain criteria which would mean that you then go to prison. So if you've used it to affect somebody else, or the document has been used multiple times, and so on and so forth. So the unintended consequence, the positive aspect is that by challenging that, the automatic incarceration, imprisonment for those workers has gone. You can still go to prison, but there's a higher test. But that was only when it was tested. So it's not entirely positive, but I've tried my best, and I hope you'll allow me that.
So, Amelia, one of the things that this just all kind of focuses back on is the absolutely critical need for investigative journalism to keep pushing out the stories that goes, do you know about this? Do you know about that? We need to know about this. We need to know about that. And the need to make sure that we don't get, like, false truths and fake news telling us lies.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to highlight some positives in this because it can feel sometimes very disempowering. As discussed earlier, the process of policy making is so opaque that it's often kind of hard to believe that as an individual you can have any impact either on the form of that policy or on adjusting the policy later. But there are these kind of formal processes whereby policies go out for consultation before they get enacted, and ways of kind of influencing that consultation are difficult to access, but they are. There is this formal process, and the voices either of individuals or individuals through grassroots organisations or more formal charities have to be heard. So it's worth investigating those routes if there is an issue that you feel strongly about, and it is worth reminding yourself not to feel overwhelmingly cynical about the kind of likelihood of your voice being listened to, because although of course there is this kind of danger point in the middle between the possible impact warnings landing on a minister's desk and the question of whether or not the minister pays adequate attention to them, and that is a kind of worrying moment, but you still need to make sure that that kind of detailed work is happening, and that work is done through charities, it's done through think tanks, through kind of grassroots organisations. Then once the policy has gone through, I mean, my job as a reporter is mainly to write about policy once it's been legislated for, and I try and go away from London as much as I can, away from Westminster. So I'm not really interviewing politicians about the policy itself, but looking at how it's playing out on the people who it's been written for. And at that stage, kind of highlighting where there are problems can be very impactful. So it really, really was in the case of the Windrush problems, and we have seen a lot of change, not enough change, but a lot of change. And that absolutely was the result of people coming to the media saying, there's a problem, you need to write about it, and the kind of the power of the media to shame ministers. But in much kind of smaller cases, all the time reporters are saying, this bit of policy isn't working, and sometimes, all of those earnest efforts by journalists get ignored, but sometimes, really there can be a very positive impact. So my kind of takeaway is that you have to remain optimistic, you have to remain unjaundiced, you have to keep writing letters to your MPs, you have to kind of try and grab the attention of journalists. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but you have to try.
Yeah. So we're going to end this session. Togara, you've created a poem, Untitled. I know that you're also performing it. Is it this evening that you're also performing?
No, I think I'll be performing tomorrow evening.
Tomorrow night, okay. So we have 3 nights of great poets with the work that they've chosen, the article they've chosen. You chose Article 13. Can you talk us about, why did you choose Article 13? Talk us through that.
Well, I'll link it to the poem itself, but Article 13 states that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, and everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country. And it's written, but it's very difficult to do for a lot of people. And the part I'm going to read is from a much longer poem, but it's a short section of the poem. And I remember arriving at in Paris and going to Place de Trocadero, and there were a lot of people who were selling miniature Eiffel Towers. And when we were walking around, all of a sudden somebody whistled, and all these people gathered up their miniature Eiffel Towers into bags, and they ran. And the police were coming. And then it was finally explained to me that these people had no papers. So they were called the sans-papiers, were people without papers and people without documents. They had obviously arrived in the country for hopes of a better future from whichever country they had come from. Now, that's what interested me about Article 13, because now, in a way, they have arrived in a country where they wanted a better future, but now they're stuck in that country because they can't get out. Because if they do, how do they get money back to their families and things like that? So they're sort of stuck in a way. The poem is called Serge and Eleanor because Eleanor Roosevelt signed the Human Rights Declaration at the Palais de Chaillot, which is by Trocadero, and which overlooks the Eiffel Tower. So you don't mind if I read it now?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to read part 3 of it. And part 3 is entitled Sans Papier. And there's an epigraph that follows the poem. The state system seems to tolerate the sans-papiers as long as they are humanoid silhouettes, not real people with real names, real addresses, real families, and personal histories. Always at the mercy of the state's shifting migration politics and the focus of many worried gazers, they are the spectral protagonists of a global narrative, one in which Europe, Africa, and Asia converge at the foot of a wrought iron tower. International Press Service 2018. The wrought iron tower is the Eiffel Tower. So the poem will begin with Serge as he's doing his work selling the miniatures at Place de Trocadero. It's a dry occupation. Cash comes in. Sorry, I'll start again. It's a dry occupation. Cash comes in with nothing real to show on his part. People simply come and go. The monument speaks for itself, and he knows the miniature of the Eiffel Tower are not made in France, but come from China. And even though he watches more fools pose as Hitler, he still smiles and hands back their change in whatever currency they demand it in. And he thanks them in one of many languages that occupy the barren landscape of his dreams. It's been almost 30 years since he came here. And this is it for him. This is how it will be. Everything now is what it is, but coated with a thin, vibrant touch that gives the sheen to gilded statues of gods and women and men on pedestals, the grand splayed wings of Palais de Chaillot spreading out from the tired arch of his scapulas. From where he has been stationed, he watches the last summer pilgrims packing up blankets and bottles of wine and beer from picnics, the cool spray of fountain of Warsaw whispering over the esplanade of the rights of men, the bathers almost gone, the fountain's pool settling to a gentle hymn beneath the evening sky. As Serge stands up from the terrace, something shifts uneasily in his being. He knows the city well, knows its people, knows the law, and knows how to be invisible beneath the law's gaze. When he first arrived in Paris, an old man gripped his arm and firmly said, "If you are seen, you are found. If you are found, you lose everything." But now something was missing, the very thing that drew him to the city, the very thing that has eluded him for years as he chased its shadow through the streets and slowly forgot the dank smell of the earth of the tilled earth from where he was born. And after he packs up and slings the bag, of miniature towers over his shoulder and walks beneath the tower itself, down along a curve on the bank of the Seine, perhaps it's the way the breeze turns upon his face that makes him look down and notice the astral blue light sailing gently off the river's surface. There's you awake, quietly skipping beneath a concourse of expensive buildings and the cold, snaking waterway. The moon, a slow missile above the city. And he slows and sits on a bench and is consumed by the movement of moonlight and water, just as he'd done many years before, with many others staring at a moonlit sea.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for giving us a story of a person that suddenly brings everything down to the individual feeling, the loneliness, the insecurity, the sense of loss, the trappedness. That's a wonderful piece of work. Thank you so much. And thanks for this session, everybody. When you're going out to lunch, you've got some questions. There's some cards that you've been given or you will be given with questions. The idea is that you go and talk to people that you don't know, and because we're all shy, you've got an excuse to go up with the card and go, well, why don't we discuss this question together? So one of the things that we hope the festival will do is just allow all of you who live and work near each other to know each other more, because you can join forces and do more together. So don't be too shy. Because there's an opportunity to break bread with strangers, so let's do that. And I'll see you later. Bye. Thanks, Togara.
Thank you.